poprosím v této chvíli o další příspěvek, to znamená People's History Museum v Manchesteru a paní Alice Parsons. Takže máte slovo.
Hello, thank you for having me. It's good to be here. Thanks for the introduction. So I'm going to talk to you a little about People's History Museum. As Thomas said, I think some of you have visited a few years ago, but we've been on quite a journey in those few years, quite a lot of change. So I'll walk you through what that looks like. I'm just going to share my screen with you. There you go. So can you all see that? Yeah. Yeah, great. So we're the People's History Museum and we are based in Manchester, in the UK. We are the UK's National Museum of Democracy, so our focus is on democracy and the fight for democracy, past, present and future. We, as I said, are based in Manchester and we started life as the Museum of Labour History, so almost 40 years ago. That is our registered name, so People's History Museum is our public name. And I'll talk a little bit about that kind of change, which is kind of in line with our presentation of working life and our kind of feelings around what working life, what we were using it for in the museum and why we wanted to communicate that message, rather than us being a kind of static museum. We've moved forward into becoming a campaigning museum in recent years. We've got 2 floors of permanent galleries, which I'll walk you through some of our permanent galleries. And we have 1 changing exhibition space also, which we programme probably anywhere between kind of 4 and 6 exhibitions per year at the moment of varying sizes and scales. Sometimes we produce those in-house. A lot of the time we're now in a co-production model. So we give our space to other groups, other organisations, members of our community in Manchester and beyond, so that we can be telling other stories in the museum spaces. So we've become a bit more of a hub of activity as well as a presenting and producing museum. In our programme as well, so within my role, I have a team of 6 in my team and we work to present the exhibitions, but also presenting events, conferences, workshops. We have a large learning strategy, so we work with people of all ages, all across the country to present learning opportunities for what it is that we present at the museum. I'm just going to stop sharing so that I can talk you through. I don't have my notes on here for some reason, so I'm going to talk you through that without the presentation, if that's still okay with you all. So we've been in Manchester for 20 years and we hold an archive and collection that reflects and documents the story of workers' rights, working life, and the fight for equality and functioning democracy in the UK. So the collection is not dissimilar to the collection we've just heard about in that it is comprised of paintings, clothing, badges, paper materials, photographs, but we do have a lot of banners. We believe we have the largest trade union banner collection in the world. So that is really our kind of major selling point as a collection. And we do a lot of work with other people's banners and we have a conservation studio to do that. The museum's purpose and ethos, I suppose, is that we believe everybody deserves to know their democratic rights, to know how to protect them and how to use them. So our vision is of a fairer society where everybody's voice is heard and people feel like they can make a difference. So this is kind of what we are using the collection to do, is to inspire people with actions of the past and of the present to feel like they can also use that voice and make a difference. Work and labour obviously play a really significant role in the telling of this story and the telling of emancipation, but we also move through stories of solidarity and campaigning more generally at the museum as well. we define the term worker. When I talk about worker, we're mainly talking about the UK working classes. So obviously we touch on a whole range of kind of jobs and work, but by virtue of starting life as a kind of union collection, we are very much talking about working classes when I refer to workers and this kind of work. So we still show a large amount of activity and exhibition about working life itself, but really we are starting, the museum mainly tells the story of how workers have played their part in the widening of democratic participation. So much as Thomas mentioned, there is in the UK a real lack of working class voices in museums, in the telling of our stories in national museums. So we have also started inviting in, I mean, there are obviously working class staff, for example, but we also invite in lots of groups to reinterpret the museum with us. It's important to say that the permanent galleries, we actually tell in a chronological order. And this is something that we toy with, because obviously the museum is there to be visited and for people to understand a kind of a narrative, but we also know that chronology of presentation is very complex and can be quite reductive. So we are aiming to not reduce history to this event led to this event led to this event, but we are trying to cover over 200 years of democratic history in the UK. So we do take at times a kind of timeline approach to presentation. So I'm going to tell you where we start. So we actually start with, and many of you will know, I'm sure, about the museum. So we start with Peterloo. So this image here, is a reimagining of. Am I still here? It just told me it was going to quit. I'm still here.
Yes,
okay.
yes.
So this is a digitization of an object that we have in the museum, and it's where we start the permanent galleries. So this is a commemorative kind of handkerchief that was made after the Peterloo Massacre, which took place in Manchester in 1819. And this is where the kind of story begins for People's History Museum. St. Peter's Square, which is where the Peterloo Massacre took place, is very close to the People's History Museum. Geographically speaking, it's in walking distance away. And for those of you that don't know, the Peterloo Massacre was a day when around 60,000 working class people showed up to hear radical speakers in Manchester to talk about political reform, mainly around voting. So at this point, Manchester, as many of you may know, is also the birthplace of the Industrial Revolution. So up until this point, most working class people had been looking after a small patch of land that they rented from a landlord, from kind of the land owning classes. They'd look after this land, they'd trade, they'd sell, and this is how people would kind of sustain their living. And we lived very rurally up until this point. At the birth of the Industrial Revolution, we went from having kind of 2 factories in Manchester to 200 factories within the space of a few years. And people started moving to cities to find work. So the working classes started to live more urban lives. But this meant that previously our representatives in Parliament, so our members of Parliament, it was based on where people lived, obviously. And as people started to leave these rural settings, populations became very, very small in these rural settings, but the members of Parliament retained their seats. So these became known as rotten boroughs. And basically Peterloo was a moment where the working classes stood up and said, we don't have representation where we're now living in these more urban environments. They also didn't have the right to vote. At this point, pretty much no one in the UK had the right to vote. You had to be male, you had to be over a certain age, you had to be a member of the landowning class. So most working people, let alone women or non-working people, could not vote. So 60,000 people showed up to call for reform, and the cavalry was sent in. And we know that at least 18 people were murdered on this day. It was a very violent day in the history of the working class movement in the UK, and it's where the kind of galleries start their scene. So we moved from this onto stories such as the Chartists and the suffragettes and other kind of major calls from marginalised groups, basically, for vote reform. And it's important to say these permanent galleries are now 10 years old. So you'll see later on what we're trying to do to keep permanent galleries relevant. I'm sure anyone who has had to work on a permanent gallery display appreciates the kind of concern and worry you have of things going out of date very quickly, not just opinions, but being able to keep people interested in the same story as they return. So we are, in the permanent galleries, we opt for quite traditional object display. So you can see in this kind of middle image here that I tried to show this one because you can see some images maybe in the background, but I can't explain to you how busy these galleries are. They're very object heavy, they're very text heavy. We're trying to cover a lot of history, but it tends to do well with our visitors. You've got some objects here like Thomas Paine's writing desk, the world's first trade union banner in the middle here, just to the right, which was created in Liverpool and is for the tin plate workers. And then down here of Peterloo that I just mentioned, these are some of the weapons that we believe were used by the cavalry on the day of the Peterloo Massacre. So we know that these objects have all been, what's interesting is we tend to opt for objects that have been in use. So, and being able to preserve them as looking like they've been in use. So conservation, obviously, of working objects is a really interesting challenge for us to ensure that they are presented properly and appropriately, but that they are also shown as having been used. So, So yeah, as I mentioned, they're 10 years old, and we've been combating this by going through some projects that I'll talk to you about later. We go forward quite quickly though. So you'll see if you've been to the museum, we go Peterloo, we go to the Chartists, and then we have one gallery that's kind of the last 100 years roughly, and then one gallery that really charts the kind of early 1900s up until around 1980. So we're going through things like the birth of the National Health Service in the UK and a lot of more solidarity campaigning for trade unions. So in the second gallery, we have really interesting displays of trade union banners, such as one that I wanted to talk to you about because it brings up a lot of what we consider as challenge, and also kind of as a live campaigning museum, is banners and material around the Grundwick Strike. So the Grundwick Strike was a strike in London at a factory in the 1970s when 6 Ugandan Asian women walked out of their factory to protest low pay, poor working conditions, and the company's refusal to acknowledge their union membership. So what's interesting about this example is that their strike was not successful. So the women did not achieve what they set out in their aims and objectives. They did not get recognised by the union. Their wages did not go up. But during this 2-year strike that they led, there were days where there were up to 20,000 people on the picket line with them. So it was a major moment and turning point for union action in the UK, and the community and the unions paid these women's wages for these 2 years so that they could continue this strike. And some of you might know, but in the UK at the moment, there is a bill going through our parliament here, which will restrict our right to protest in the UK. So there is, the bill aims to basically remove our right to organise in large, well, not even large groups, small groups in public. It's really going to be quite an attack on quite a lot of what the museum is about. So as a museum, we're actively campaigning against that. And Grundwick for me is a really interesting example for us, because in the debate around whether or not we should be allowed to protest or not as workers in solidarity with others, we very much think about the binary of, well, was it a successful campaign or did they not get what they wanted? And in this respect, in Grundwick, no, the campaigners did not get what they sought to achieve. But what we did get was a mass demonstration of solidarity across marginalised groups, across workers' groups. So these 6 women, as I say, were joined by, this is the Grundwick Strike, we're joined by 20,000 others on some days. So, and a lot of those were white working class union paying members, people in kind of mining communities. So it was a real turning point for union action, which for us demonstrates the kind of, not side effects of protests and emancipation, but the complexity of, it's not about either getting what you wanted or you fail. It's not a win or fail kind of situation. So many people were really surprised at the time by this as well, because as racism and anti-immigrant views were really common in union members at the time. And for us, you'll see later on, I'll talk about a migration project that we have currently, but it really kind of showed a moment of significant change. So these are some of our more traditional union banners. So I've mentioned we have, to our knowledge, the largest collection of union banners, and we rotate these. So if you come to the museum at any given time, there might be different banners on display. We don't tend to change any of the other objects in the permanent galleries, though. It is mainly just these banners. So the co-production model, so here's another of our banners. So I'm going to talk to you about where we started to look at what we had in the permanent galleries and what we didn't have, most importantly. So we have a changing exhibition space, but our permanent galleries are quite void or quite, can be quite reductionist in spaces. So for example, we might have a whole half a gallery about the Chartists, a very other independent labour movement, really significant part of our democratic history here in the UK. But then we might just have one, for example, we did just have one panel on the contribution of LGBT people to the fight for equality. So we did some consultation work about things that matter to our visitors, people who hadn't come to the museum, to try and find some other stories that we should be telling through our collection, that we should be actively collecting also. And one that came up that we did in 2017 was the role that the LGBT community has played, not just in their own emancipation and their own fight for equality, but in solidarity with other campaigns. So this banner here was a banner that was used in the Lesbians and Gays Support the Miners campaign, which has been celebrated through a film. There's a big blockbuster film called Pride about this that some of you may have seen. But we decided to go through this approach, not curating it in-house. So each year now, if we are to choose a program theme, we then go and employ for a year or 2 years, what we call community curators or a community program team of people with lived experience of the topic that we're going to be working on for those 2 years. So in the instance of Never Going Underground, we worked with a group of people from the LGBT community. We work with people on a paid basis so they can come and research the collection with us, and then we co-curate our exhibitions now with a different group or community or representatives from that community each year. So if we go to the next slide, please. So the really interesting one that we have on at the moment is with Never Going Underground. We produced an exhibition in our changing gallery space, which was excellent. And we also made kind of new interpretation for the permanent galleries. So we did some research about, are there people in the permanent galleries, key figures from the history of the fight for democracy that have a story to tell in relation to LGBT history. So we've updated a lot of interpretation in those galleries now through new research. If we know that certain political figures or people that we talk about were also part of that community. And most recently this year, this image that you're looking at is we've done a series of interventions around migration. So we did some consultation around what was missing in the galleries, and we did not have significant enough telling of the contribution of migrant workers in particular to the UK. and we didn't have any contemporary stories of migration. So we worked with 5 people with lived experience of migration to the UK for the last 2.5 years, and presented new interpretation, animations that you can see a still from at the moment, to present new narratives really on the migrant experience, but particularly on the migrant experience as workers, and contributing to that part of the UK, not just the economy, but UK society, a retelling really in the words of people with that lived experience of what it means to be a migrant in the UK, why people migrate, what it means to be a worker in the UK, to inform our audiences and our visitors of why some people who migrate aren't allowed to work, what that means, what work means to us in terms of our personal identities. So if we go to the next slide, and then the final thing we made with that team was 3 trails for families mainly. So I'm sure we'll talk about it, and others will have similar challenges, but by being a museum that definitely doesn't shy away from difficult topics, we didn't want that to mean we were only a museum for adults. So we are a family-friendly museum. We've won a number of awards for that. So we produced these passport trails in collaboration with our community program team, so that visitors can facilitate a conversation with a young person or child about these topics as they go around the museum. So they can be asking people, you know, why do you think you might want to work if you came to the UK, and why can't you? And really challenging some of the stereotypes that we know. So increasingly, and then on top of that, we then we collect kind of contemporary materials each year depending on our subject themes. So we're currently collecting actively around migration, and we're standing against there's another bill going through Parliament in the UK that seeks to make it even more difficult than it already is to seek asylum in the UK. So using our collection and our stories to actively campaign and be a space for people to come and learn about that and stand in solidarity. So very much learning from solidarity campaigns across workers' groups of the past, being a place that others can come and be part of that solidarity campaign in the present. So yes, that is me. I've raced through it, but if anyone has any questions, I'd be very happy to chat. Thanks.
Děkuju moc. Zeptám se účastníků, jestli mají otázky. Je možné se hlásit s dvižením ruky v té nabídce reakce vpravo dole v panelu. Pravím do Dánska a dávám slovo nejprve do Dánska. Omlouvám se, protože tam nemáte jméno, já se vám nepamatuju. Yes. Thomas Meldgaard má slovo.
Thomas. Yeah, I'm sorry you can't see that on the screen, but my name is Thomas. And thank you, Alice, for a really interesting presentation. One of the problems that we are struggling with in Denmark is because we're still called the Workers' Museum, and sometimes we are thinking about who is a worker today. And is that a question that you are considering too, or are you just saying, okay, it's just not important anymore? There are other questions that are more important or more problems, other problems that we have to deal with, so we don't think very much about that.
No, I think it's definitely a question that we think about a lot, particularly in line with a future without work is something that's a real consideration for us at the moment. And obviously the value that we attribute to work has changed significantly, not least because, at least in the UK, the value of a job is very different now. People do not find the same pride in work as we may be used to, largely because of union participation, but all sorts of other reasons, of course, are changing our relationship to work. When we think about unions, you know, I don't know if you have similar disputes, but we've been thinking about disputes for, you know, Uber drivers and delivery people, you know, and what that looks like compared to the miners' strike. Like, is that our modern day miners' strike kind of thing? And I do think it's still significant, but we are moving definitely towards more of a campaigning space around what does it mean if you can't work as well? And that's a big question for, like, next year's campaign is around disability activism. And for us, rather than labouring the fact that of all these kind of things that prohibit people from working or exclude people from the workplace. Where else do we find kind of meaning and purpose and solidarity? So I think who a worker is really, and you know, we think about it in a museum setting ourselves. Museum workers don't get seen as like workers in the UK, you know, in the same way that you might if you are, or like same as like academics. Whereas if you're a shop worker, it feels like those class definitions have really moved on in the UK. So it's something we grapple with constantly, and I think it's a real driver for why we changed our name to People's History Museum, so that if you're not a worker or don't self-identify as a member of the working classes, you can still find resonance in what we tell, the stories that we tell in the museum, if that answers your question.
Thank you.
Děkuji moc. Poprosím Ninu Sol.
Hi, good morning. Thank you very much, Alice. I'm Nina from the Museum of Work in Hamburg. And I'm quite amazed by the very clear political standpoint that you have in Manchester. And we're struggling a bit with it. So my question is, how did you get there? How was the process? And was there conflict involved, and how did you deal with it?
Yeah, definitely. There was conflict. There still is, you know, and the process is very ongoing in that sense. So and it's interesting, we get told quite a lot that we're not neutral as a space, and there's a real call for some reason in the UK for museums to be neutral spaces. And we basically had to have an internal conversation about how confident we felt just declaring that we're not neutral. So there are some things that we believe it's important to demonstrate neutrality on. We're not party political. You know, we can't say we support this party, for example. But case by case, we are having to make decisions around who we stand in solidarity with as an organisation. And I think the decision was definitely made mainly around wanting to be there's a model that we use called the useful museum. So we're trying to think about what our purpose is in society now. And if we're to have a purpose that is one step beyond informing people of the past and is more about inciting action in the future, we also need to be seen to take a stance. There are campaigns, though, of course, that we get partners who contact us and say, please stand in solidarity with this campaign. And case by case, we have to decide if it's kind of too binary to do that, if that makes sense. But we also take a lot of advice from our partners year to year. So this year with the migration programme, we really said we want to stand against this bill that is going to criminalise seeking asylum. So we spoke to our migration team and they were very keen for us to also do that. And we went and sought advice from places like Amnesty International. So each campaign that we choose, we have to go through quite a lot of, as we do as individuals as well, a lot of research about what we want to stand with. But it's definitely, it's interesting. You want to write a policy on it, but you just can't. You have to every day be like, okay, this has happened now. You know, like you'll wake up here and the government want to ban us all from protesting, and we all had to get together and go, how do we feel about that as a museum that celebrates protest and the change that has happened there? So it's really iterative, and it's really interesting there's about 30 members of staff at the museum. So trying to keep everyone as part of that conversation, particularly because the people who have to deal with the public's opinion on that are our colleagues who work in the kind of visitor services side of the museum. So it's very easy for someone in the office to say, we're going to do this campaign, and then go back to their office if we've not worked with everyone who has to encounter a member of the public. Like, you know, with this together, we're doing it together with Refugees Project, and people have left us comments in the building that are extreme, that are racist, that are, you know, that are against people seeking asylum. And like, we have to be sure that we as staff know how we'll deal with that. But I'll wrap up there. But basically just I'm happy to talk outside of it, but it's definitely one that we have to keep reflecting on all the time.
Děkuji moc. Poprosím ještě Jirgena Šmita a Bohumila Melichara dohromady. Teď ty dvě krátké otázky a pak se budeme muset posunout dál. To je Jürgen Schmidt.
Yeah, thanks, Alex, for your presentation. And it is not a question, it is just a short remark, because you mentioned that you started as a labor history museum, so to say. One of the very important institutes in Germany, which was dealing with the research on the history of labor movements, had, so to say, to survive and to legitimize its continuous work. And they decided and also changed their name from the Institute for the Research on Labor Movements to the Institute for Research on Social Movements. So you see that, and it is also, I think, happened in a similar time when you changed your name. So it is a European phenomenon that already Tomáš described for the Czech development.
No, that's interesting. Yeah, I think it becomes less exclusionary, but it is interesting because we're still registered as that. So we have a lot of visitors who've been coming to the museum for many years who definitely still want us to be the Museum of Labour History, you know, and really feel very passionately about that. So it's also about kind of increasing and inviting new audiences and not being, you know, not having to have a prerequisite knowledge on something, but it can be very divisive. I think some people really miss the old title.
Děkuji moc. Bohumil Melichar má slovo.
Thank you for your very important message. Can I ask a question about concepts and narrative behind your galleries and exhibitions?
Mm-hmm.
Do you interpret the working history through Marxist historians of 60s like E.P. Thompson or Eric Hobsbawm, or there is a new and maybe more important interpretation and these classics are just outdated for you?
I don't know if they're outdated, but we definitely don't use them as a framework. So the permanent galleries themselves were definitely done with an attempt at, although we were speaking, an attempt 10 years ago at some sort of neutrality. But now, because most of our interpretation is done in collaboration with different individuals and different organizations and groups, the interpretations, it's interesting because my background is interpretations. That's what I used to do at Science Museum. And that has a very clear kind of approach. Whereas now it's, I think particularly because of the interventions, it's revised basically every time with who we're trying to talk to in mind, if that makes sense. So it's very kind of audience focused. So we're very much, who do we want to come and encounter this? Like with the migration program, the team wanted that to be targeted at people who didn't have experience of migration. So they wanted it to be kind of informing, whereas the disabled activist group wanted to be for other people with disabilities. So they're very conscious that they're going to use quite a different framework for their presentation. So, but in the permanent galleries, no, also we don't use a kind of Marxist lens.